We've been talking about how this book and how its thoughts may intersect with our own Christian faith. Who remembers what Jesus responded when asked, "What is the greatest commandment?" What did Jesus say?
Love thy neighbor.
Oh, almost. You're almost there.
Love thy neighbor.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is like it now.
Love thy neighbor.
Love your neighbor as yourself. What is the assumption that comes beneath that entire lesson? Beneath those two commandments, what is assumed? That you have the capacity of love, absolutely. Anything else? That you love yourself. You can't love somebody else if you don't love yourself. The first section of this book dealt with the love of others, the ones just like us. The second part of this book dealt with the love of opponents, not those who are. She was very careful not to say enemies, because enemies is permanent and opponents is a temporary situation where we might be able to work it out. Now she comes around to the third area and the next three set of rules or ways of revolutionary love. How to love ourselves. Now, that's not singular, according to Valerie Carr. It's a plural. Love ourselves. We must not only love just me, I must not love just myself, but rather we all must love ourselves in community, as a community of faith, who are different, who have different views and different opinions, but the emphasis is on the collective ourselves. And that reminds us that each of our own individual health and well-being are connected to the wellness of the community of a whole. And what more than COVID has shown us that it takes our care for one another to put a mask on and take care of one another as well as ourselves. What more does this book have to show us about this revolutionary love? When we talked about loving others, we talked about wondering about them and their perspective. We talked about grieving alongside of them, grieving for what they have lost. And then we talked about fighting for them. When we talked about loving our opponents, we talked about tending to wounds, both our own that have been caused by those who oppose us, and our opponents' wounds, and loving them through our rage and listening to them and to our own pain, and then reimagining what the world might look like with a different set of norms ruling. Today we move to loving ourselves, and the metaphor that Valerie Carr gives us is that of birth. Now, it's only one portion of humanity that becomes a mother through the process of childbirth. There's plenty of people who become a mother without that, through adoption, through the care of someone else's child who sees you as their mother. But Carr utilitizes, that's the word, the metaphor of birthing to describe revolutionary love and the practices of loving ourselves by breathing, by pushing, and by transition. And while she uses this portion of the book, as she does so much of her book, to talk about world, to talk about social issues, to talk about the world around us, I really want to turn this back at us. I want to talk about our individual and our corporate lives. I'm not ignoring the impact that all of this can have on the wider world if everybody were to practice it, but I recognize that revolutionary love is a practice that extends beyond ourselves, and it's really a tool to transform the world into God's kindom. Yes, that was an intentional typo in your bulletin. Kindom, the reign of all kin. But on this day, this week, before we finalize our fall campaign by collecting our 2022 pledges and our pledges toward the technology in this space, before we launch into a time of reimagining our ministries as a community of faith today, I want to look at this metaphor and how it relates to the church with a capital C, the church. COVID has changed us, and we cannot go back to what we were. Hear Valerie Kaur's words that she shared in 2016 at the Metropolitan AME Church in D.C. And you may have seen the video of this on YouTube. She says, "The future is dark, but what if? What if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but is the darkness of the womb? What if we are not dead, but a country waiting to be born? What if all of our grandfathers and grandmothers are standing behind us now? Those who have survived occupation and genocide, those who have survived slavery and Jim Crow, detentions and political assault. What if they're whispering in our ear, 'You are brave'? What if this is our nation's greatest transition? The image of birthing change, of birthing a new existence. Hear those words reworded just a little bit to talk about the post-pandemic church and all that we've been through in these last, is it 20 months? It feels like it's 90 months. Hear them this way. The future is dark. But what if the darkness is the darkness of the tomb? It is not the darkness of the tomb, but is instead the darkness of the womb. What if we're not dying, but we're waiting to be born anew? What if all those who have been behind the 140 years of this congregation's history are now standing behind us, pushing us forward and saying, whispering in our ear, "You are brave. You can do this." Now, birth is a messy metaphor, and I'm not going to, there's children in the room. There's people in the room who have not witnessed birth. I'm not going to horrify you with that. But there are stages of labor, stages of giving birth. And the most important thing that anyone can do in this process is remember to breathe. And if you've got a good coach reminding you to breathe, your breath, your oxygen helps you through that process. It helps too if you rub your belly that's so contracting, because that neurologically redirects your attention away from the pain and toward the contact with the skin. Yes, that helps, but it's breathing and remembering to breathe. What does breath give to you in a day-to-day situation? It gives you love, that's right. What else does breath give to you? It gives you life. What does breathing do when you're in the middle of something? It can calm you. It can also alert you that you're panicking. I have been trying, and that's a key word, to run again, post-COVID. Pre-COVID, 5 miles was nothing. Post-COVID, 3 blocks is a lot. But the biggest thing is my breathing. It's no longer the same. I used to be able to, just as I would sing music or play the piano or the organ, I used to be able to just breathe as I ran rhythmically with my steps. And it doesn't work anymore. It simply doesn't work. And twice, Dan has had to pick me up off the curb because I won't run alone, and he's been with me, and I couldn't catch my breath. Post 9/11, Valerie Kaur writes, I had been made to believe that overwork was the only way to make a difference. I had to come to measure my sense of worth by how much I produced, how well I responded, and how quickly. I worked for so long, so hard, and at such great speeds that I became accustomed to breathlessness. Do you feel like that sometimes? What are the models of collective care that help us to breathe? What are the practices of love that we can practice through our corporate breathing? What can we do together to help us all take a deep breath? We can gather. There's a lot of strength in gathering, isn't there, Neil? From the voice of a 6-year-old. What else?
We can take a pause from what we're doing.
Take a pause. That's what my sabbatical is about in 88 days, not that I'm counting. Yes, we can take a pause and just change the rhythm of how we're doing things. What else can we do together that will help us to breathe? To reoxygenate our life stream. Pray, sing. Yes, all of these are great. Valerie Kaur writes, breathing creates space for our lives to think and see differently, to enliven our imagination, awake to pleasure, move towards freedom, and let joy in. To let joy in. Can you imagine what joy feels like after all this time of not having all the things we've been doing? The congregation is about to step in with the council before I leave for sabbatical and then after while I'm gone on sabbatical, and take a time of breathing. Take a time of reimagining. Take a time to rethink and think outside of the box of how we are a community together. Now, breathing is something that not all of us are able to do. Some of us encounter barriers to caring for ourselves and doing it well because the most dominant institutions around us in our nation and even in our community are driven by the need to be the best, driven by the capitalistic concept of always getting ahead, always producing more, always increasing wealth. And our nation is driven and steeped in injustices and inequalities and dual standards, and these things get in the way of some of us being able to breathe. Breathing is one stage. Another stage of birth is pushing. Now, this gets a little tricky when we talk about the church because nobody likes to be pushed around. I'm not talking about anyone. I'm talking about pushing the future into existence. Push as a practice of revolutionary love is to choose to engage our grief, our rage, our trauma, in order to create new possibilities in ourselves and in others. Pushing requires us to discern the right times to breathe and to rest. The right times to push deeper into the difficult sensations, emotions, and thoughts, however painful they might be. But pushing is the second practice of loving ourselves. It accompanies the practice of breathing. To push is to enter into that grief, rage, or trauma as a part of the healing process. Pushing requires us to determine the right moments, the right rhythm of breathing and resting. Valerie Kaur writes, when I was finally ready to love myself, I had to learn how to breathe and push through my grief, rage, and trauma. On the other side, I found what seemed utterly impossible before: healing, forgiveness, and even reconciliation. How do we find that rhythm of when to breathe and when to push forward? What are the cues that tell us it's time to move from breathing and resting and pushing forward? When you are ready to start your day, how do you know you're ready to start your day? The alarm clock goes off. What are the alarm clocks around us going off, telling us it's time to get up and move? The sun is rising. Morning. As a community, as a world, post-COVID, what's telling us that it might be time to start moving again? Things that need to be done. Discerning what needs to be done tells us that it might be time to push. What else? The needs of the people around us. We knew that there were still plenty of hungry people. Even though it's COVID, we had to figure out how to do Saturday meals again. It was time to push into a different way of being Saturday meals. We knew we needed to gather for worship, and so we needed to find new ways to push into the future, even if that meant singing with these really duck-face masks. In what ways does breathing and pushing transform us, heal us, both as individuals and as a community? How does moving forward help us feel whole again? It gets us out of ourselves. Absolutely. Gets us out of ourselves. How else does it transform us? How else does it change us? How else does it move us? It gives us purpose. How many more days could we stay home looking at a screen? But there's something significant that Valerie Kaur says that has to be said again every time we talk about forgiveness and reconciliation. We have to talk about forgiveness. It is not forgetting. It is not just obliterating everything that happened. Rather, forgiveness is freedom from hate. It is freedom from self-hate. It is freedom from hate of another. Healing has its own timeline for everyone, and no one should be pushed to forgive someone who's caused them harm. She writes, sometimes the choice to withhold forgiveness is an act of agency too. Forgiveness and reconciliation are related, but they are distinct processes. Forgiveness is a process that one can do on their own that does not require participation from the other person who committed the harm. Reconciliation, however, rests on accountability and requires the perpetrators to accept all responsibility for their actions. And when we are the perpetrator and we take responsibility for the harm we've caused, we can also reflect love for ourselves. We can create systems of accountability beyond mere punishment and retribution. I believe it was Adlai Stevenson who said, we evolve our pursuit of justice from retribution, an eye for an eye, to collective liberation. We evolve our pursuit of justice from retribution, an eye for an eye, to collective freedom. Pushing together, engaging in projects of healing and forgiveness and reconciliation as a community, as a nation, is a necessary part of the labor of love. That last stage, I'm not going to spend as much time on it. Transition is that stage when the person giving birth becomes very witchy. Ask my husband, he will tell you. in no uncertain terms, he did not want to be in the room with me in transition when I called him every explicative in the book and told him to get out of there. It's one we're not of our right mind. It is the most dangerous stage of birth. It is in that stage that women die in childbirth. But it is a necessary stage. It is when our ancestors, or as Valerie Kaur says, all of her grandmothers behind her stood on her with their hands on her shoulder, saying, "You can do this. You are brave. You can push through this pain." We need a midwife to help us through the transition. We need to play midwife for one another to help one another emerge from the transition, from the change. That midwife will come for this congregation while I'm on sabbatical in the form of Brandon Simmons, who is a United Church of Christ pastor who will be doing 3 workshops with you to help you reimagine what it is to be the community of faith, or church with a capital C, in this time. How do we need to rearrange ourselves? How do we need to work out the newness? How do we push through the transition so that new life can be born? Each week I send you home with something to think about, something to ponder. I've said numerous times you can text me or you can email me or you can call me if you have something you want to talk about, but please write it down and journal about it, or at least think about it or talk about it over lunch when you leave here. My question for you this day is, how do we individually and we corporately play midwife for one another? How do we individually and how do we corporately be the midwife that ushers in new life and walks the birthing body through that change? Next week is the last of our 10-week series, and we're going to talk about joy. Joy is a practice of revolutionary love, and it's the core practice that sustains all the others. And in that process, we are going to bring forward our pledges, and with a lot of noise and sometimes a little silliness, but we're going to do it, and we're going to do it safely, but it's going to be fun. And so I encourage you to think about joy and the birth and transition that needs to happen. Amen.